Hello, hello. Welcome to the Robots and Pencils Academy. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. And today we're going to take a look at one of the most important controls in your arsenal for building kick-butt iPhone applications. And that's the UI table view. This little baby is used pretty much everywhere. You use it when you access your mail. That's a table view there. You use it when you're scrolling through your settings. And even this is a table here, how these groupings and controls are laid out. And you even use it when you're looking at, really nice, beautifully rendered applications like Path here. This is a UI table view that we're scrolling through here. It's used pretty much everywhere in applications. And today we're going to look at how it works, how you can populate it, and get it working for you in your applications. Now, when we create these storyboards, we're going to do them two different ways. The first way we're going to do them is using something called storyboards with an Xcode. We're going to drag out a storyboard, create a table view in there, and we're going to show you how that works. Then we're going to do it a little bit more of a manual, hands-on way using nibs. I just want you to see both ways of doing this so you can appreciate what storyboards do and also what you have to do sometimes if you want to create these things from scratch. But let's start with the storyboard and see how that works. All right, so let's begin by creating a new Xcode project. This is going to be a single view application, and we'll give it a name like, let's just call it storyboard for now. One thing we want to make sure of is that this Use Storyboard is selected down here because we're going to do this with storyboards. Go ahead and save that project wherever you like. And when it comes up, I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. And when it comes up, go ahead and click on that main storyboard element over here. This is our canvas. This is where we're going to actually create our UI table view controller. Now to start off, I want to start from scratch. So I'm just going to get rid of a couple files that were created for us by default. Just going to get rid of those. I'm just going to move the app delegate down into the supporting files just to kind of get those out of the way. So what we should have now is an empty storyboard file with absolutely nothing in it. Now creating a UI table view in a controller using storyboards is actually pretty easy. First we're going to drag out a UI table view controller. Then we're going to create a custom class and associate it with the controller. And then thirdly, we're going to implement the delegates and data sources for that table and basically say, here's the data you need to populate into your table. Let's start with the view controller. Now, the table view controller we want to use, we can find down here amongst our elements. And the first thing we're going to do is just simply drag it out here. That's step one, setting up our UI table view controller. Next, we need a class to back up or power this view controller. We can create one by going File, New File here, or Command N. And this is going to be an Objective-C class, but it's not just any Objective-C class. We want this to be a UI table view controller class. So we want to make sure that we're subclassing this guy down here. Then we can give it a name like my table view controller. Click Next. Go ahead and save that right in the project. And now what we have here is a class which is basically going to power our view controller. Now what you're seeing here is some of the template or boilerplate code that Xcode gives us when we're creating a brand new UI table view. So down here you'll see some data source methods that we want to implement, like how many sections are in our table view. A section is sort of the gray separation areas. We can have multiple sections with multiple tables. Here we need to specify the number of rows in our section. Here we can define, we can create a cell, an individual table cell at a specific row in our table. And here's some other optional stuff that they give us if we wanted to do more complicated things with our table view, like determine when a selection or when one of our rows was tapped. These are just some things that it gives us for free. Now, for the purposes of our demonstration today, we don't actually need a lot of this stuff here. I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible, and we're not going to look at a lot of the more fancy table view elements. So I'm just going to delete a lot of the stuff that it gave us. Cell for index, cell for row at index path, we're going to keep that. We're going to keep the number of rows in a section. We don't need this number of sections in a table view. The default is 1. So we're just going to go ahead and get rid of that. And this is some other view controller stuff that normally we would leave in if we were doing a real application. But for now, just to keep things simple, I'm going to go ahead and remove that. So we should have a pretty bare bones implementation here, just with an itWithStyle method, number of rows and sections, and cell for row at index path. That's all we really need for the data source and the methods. Now, before we get into what each of one of these sections does, there's just one more thing we need to do before we can start using our controller, and that is whenever we create a custom class for a controller, we always need to hook it up to the controller itself. So what we can do is go back to our storyboard and click on our view here. And then if we go look at this custom class section under attributes, you can see right now it says this is a UI table view controller. We actually want this to be the custom class we just created called my table view controller. So if we just go in there and do that, now this class is hooked up and ready to back up this view controller we just dragged out. That's just something we need to do before we can use it. And we'll know that that class is hooked up to this controller if we go up to our assistant editor here, click this, and we should now see my table view controller pop up for the assistant editor for this view controller. Okay, let's go back to the mytableviewcontroller.m file. I'm just going to make a little bit of space here, and let's go over and take a look at what each one of these methods are and really what we need to do in order to fulfill our contract for a UI table view. A UI table view is made up of really two parts. There's a delegate part, which gives us callbacks and tells us when things happen on our table. And then there's the data source part, which is basically us giving the data to the table view. For example, we can look at these. If we go to, I'm just going to drag this over a bit. If we go into UI table view, if we just click on that and hold down the option key, this is going to turn into a little question mark. And this is one way you can get quick help on any given class. You can just hold down option, come down here, and to get more information on a given class. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to go look at that implementation. I'm going to hold down the command key and then click on UI table view. And that's actually going to take us to the code behind the UI table view. Now this is a big class. There's lots going on in here. You don't need to worry about quite everything in here. But the one section I did want to show you is right around here. You can see there's two properties here that we're interested in right now. The UI table view data source, that's us giving or telling our table what's going to be there. And the UI table view delegate, those are the callbacks I was mentioning. And if we go look at each one of these, data source, as you can see from our protocol, there's two required methods we need to implement if we're going to act as a data source for our table. One is we need to tell it the number of rows in a given section. And two, we need to give it a cell for a given row at a certain index path. An index path is basically the section we're in addition to the row. So when each one of those table rows renders, it asks for a cell. That's what this cell is. That's what this object is here. But there's really just two methods we need to implement from a data source point of view: number of rows in section and cell for row at index path. Now if we go back and take a look at that table view delegate, if we look at this guy, we'll see that every method here is actually optional, meaning we don't actually have to implement anything technically to do a bare bones implementation of a UI table view. These are all optional methods we can implement if we want information, or if we want to give information about the table view or receive some callbacks. These are all some methods that we could implement if we wanted. For example, if we wanted to set the row height at a given row in our table, we could do that. If we wanted to get some callbacks, like or will select row would be an event that would fire if our row is about to be selected. These are all different things you can go through and take a look at, and there's lots of stuff in here. But from a bare bones implementation point of view, we actually don't need to implement any of these. All we need is basically number of rows in section and cell for row at index path. That's all we need to do our bare bones table view implementation. Now before this table is going to work for us, there's three things we need to do. One, we need to give it some data and describe the data we actually want to go into our table. Two, we need to fill in this little bit of information here. We need to tell it how many rows are in each of our is in our table. And thirdly, we just need to do a little bit of work down here. If we're going to populate something or do something interesting in our cell, we need to come down here and just configure it. So really just those three steps. But let's start with the data. Now, when getting data for a table cell, it can obviously come from anywhere. It could come from a network call. It could come from a database, a web service of some kind. Here, we're just going to keep it really simple. I'm going to create a property and just hard code some data right in here. I'm just going to create an array, and I'm just going to call it data. And we're just going to do that like this. Now, because of this version of Xcode I'm using, I still need to synthesize that data property. I won't need to do this line with future versions of Xcode, but for now we need to synthesize it. And then we're going to actually instantiate the data in the getter for this property. So just if there is no array that's been created, create one, put some data in there, and then just return that. That really sets up our data for the table. Next, let's go down to this section down here and tell our data how many rows we have in this given section. For us, this is going to be really easy. We're just going to return the count, the row count from our data here. So we've got an array. We're just going to reference that property through self here, and then just return the count, which is the number of elements in that array. In this case, it's going to be 3. And the third thing we need to do is just come down here and actually configure our cell. Here, I'm just going to set the label in the cell itself. So I'm just going to get the text label, and we're just going to set the text in there to be the contents of the element at our at where we are with depending upon the row that we're at with our data. So we're just going to go self.data object at row, and here we're just going to pass in our index path dot row. And what that's basically going to do is, depending upon what row we're at in the table, it's going to go into our array, pass in the element or the row that we're at, starting with a 0. This is a 0-based array, and then pull that string out and set that to be the text of our label here. That's all we're going to do in this line. So with that, hopefully everything will be configured. I'm going to hit the run button. I just went Command R, but you can also hit the run button up here. That should fire up our simulator. Here it comes, and hopefully we'll see some data in there. Uh-oh, something went wrong. Let's go back to our console here, and it said assertion failure, cell for row, inconsistency exception, UITableView data source must return a cell. I know we forgot. There's one important thing I forgot to mention. Let's go back here and take a look. One thing that makes the iPhone such a joy to use is how fast it is. And one way that iOS achieves a lot of speed and efficiency is it reuses these table cells here. In other words, if we had a table with 10,000 rows, it would never create 10,000 rows or table view cells and have those sitting around. It might create tens or 20s, and based on how many we can see at a given time, just have those available for us, and it recycles them as we go through here. Now, an important part of recycling and dequeuing these from a pool is this identifier here. This is very important. We need to make sure that we have a way of identifying what cells we want to put in this table. So one thing I forgot to mention or do is when you go back here and you click on your table cell, I'm just going to come here and click on that. And then if I bring up the side here, we need to make sure that the cell identifier is set here. In this case, it's not, so it has no way of requeuing these. So I'm going to put in my cell here as the identifier for this cell row. And then I'm going to come down here and make sure I have that same string down here. This is very important. Now it's going to be able to take these cells, create them, and then use them and reuse the similar cells for different rows of data. Here we've only got 3 rows, so it's not a big deal, but you can imagine if we had a lot, how important that would be. All right, let's try that out and see what happens. And ta-da, there we go. There's data in our table. Well, I think that's good for now. This podcast is getting a bit long. We'll leave it here. This is part 1, but this is great. We've got a table view controller that we dragged out with a storyboard. We saw how to populate it with data, what we needed to implement, and then how to hook up and configure and reuse table cells. That's a great first start. Come back for part 2 and we'll look at how to do something very similar, but this time with nibs. There's a few extra steps we need to do with nibs. I'll also explain a little bit more about what the differences are between storyboards and nibs. Thanks a lot for coming out. We'll see you in part 2. Bye-bye.